December 6, 1941. In the Pacific, an enormous fleet moved in total radio silence, its target, the heart of American naval power. Yet in Hawaii, Sunday morning dawned with a quiet peace, unsuspecting of the catastrophe to come. Today, we recount the greatest surprise attack in modern history. The calculated risk by Japan's Admiral Yamamoto to deliver a knockout blow that would cripple the United States and change the course of a world war. This is the moment that shocked a nation and ended an era of isolation. This is the attack on Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands awoke to another beautiful Sunday. The sun rose over the Pacific Ocean, casting golden light across the waters of Pearl Harbor, where the United States Pacific Fleet lay at anchor. Sailors slept late after Saturday night liberty. Officers enjoyed leisurely breakfasts. A few early risers prepared for church services or weekend recreation. It was, by all appearances, a morning of peace. But within minutes, that peace would be shattered forever. And the world, already consumed by war in Europe and Asia, would change irrevocably. This is the story of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the day of infamy that brought America into the Second World War and altered the course of history. But to understand December 7th, we must first understand how the United States and Japan arrived at this moment, how two nations that had once enjoyed relatively cordial relations came to stand on the brink of war. The roots of the conflict stretched back years, even decades. Japan, a rapidly industrializing island nation with limited natural resources, had embarked on an aggressive campaign of expansion in the 1930s. Manchuria had been invaded and occupied in 1931. China had been attacked in 1937, leading to a brutal war that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives and showed no sign of ending. Japan's leaders, a coalition of military officers and ultranationalists who increasingly dominated the government, spoke of creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a Japanese-dominated economic and political bloc that would free Asia from Western colonialism. In reality, this meant Japanese military occupation, exploitation of resources, and brutal subjugation of conquered populations. The United States watched Japan's expansion with growing alarm. American interests in China were threatened. The principles of international law and national sovereignty were being violated. And increasingly, American policymakers came to see Japan as a threat not just to regional stability but to American security in the Pacific. The American response was economic pressure. Through 1940 and 1941, the United States imposed increasingly severe economic sanctions on Japan. Scrap metal exports were restricted. Aviation fuel was embargoed. And finally, in July 1941, the United States froze Japanese assets and imposed a complete oil embargo, cutting off Japan's access to the fuel that powered its military machine. This was an existential threat to Japan. The island nation imported 80% of its oil, much of it from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. Japan's military, particularly the Navy, consumed enormous quantities of oil. Without access to foreign oil supplies, Japan's strategic reserves would be exhausted within 18 months. The war in China could not be sustained. The fleet would be immobilized. Japan would be forced to capitulate to American demands or find an alternative source of oil. The alternative, as envisioned by Japan's military leadership, was to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, by force. But this presented a problem. Such an aggressive move southward would certainly provoke a military response from the United States, whose Pacific Fleet was based at Pearl Harbor, perfectly positioned to interdict Japanese operations. Enter Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yamamoto was 57 years old in 1941, a career naval officer who had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood America, its industrial capacity, its potential military strength, better than most Japanese leaders. And paradoxically, Yamamoto opposed war with the United States. He had argued against the alliance with Nazi Germany. He had warned his superiors that Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industrial might. He supposedly told one minister that he could run wild for 6 months in a war with America, but after that, he had no confidence in victory. But Yamamoto was a naval officer, and he had his orders. If war with the United States was inevitable, and by the autumn of 1941, it appeared to be, then Yamamoto would plan how to fight it. And his plan was audacious, risky, and potentially decisive: a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, delivered with overwhelming force before the United States could respond. Yamamoto's strategic vision was clear. Japan could not defeat the United States in a long war. American industrial capacity was 10 times greater than Japan's. American population was nearly twice as large. In a war of attrition, Japan would lose. But if Japan could deliver a devastating blow at the outset, crippling the Pacific Fleet, eliminating America's ability to project power into the Western Pacific, then perhaps the United States would negotiate a peace settlement rather than commit to a long, costly war across the Pacific. It was a gamble based on a fundamental misunderstanding of American psychology and political culture. But in late 1941, it seemed like Japan's only option. The planning for the Pearl Harbor attack was meticulous and conducted in absolute secrecy. A special task force, the Kido Butai, or First Air Fleet, was organized, comprising 6 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These carriers would transport 353 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers across the Pacific to launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The technical challenges were enormous. Pearl Harbor was shallow, too shallow for conventional aerial torpedoes, which would dive deep into the mud before exploding. Japanese engineers developed special wooden fins that allowed torpedoes to run in shallow water. Pilots trained for months on mock-ups of Pearl Harbor, practicing attack runs until every detail was memorized. And yet, despite the secrecy, there were warning signs, signals that, in retrospect, should have alerted American intelligence that something was coming. American cryptanalysts had broken Japanese diplomatic codes and were reading Japanese communications, an intelligence program called MAGIC. They knew that relations between the two countries were deteriorating rapidly. They knew that Japanese diplomats in Washington had been ordered to destroy their code machines, a clear sign that war was imminent. But there was confusion about where Japan would strike. Most American military planners believed the attack would come in the Philippines, or perhaps Malaya or the Dutch East Indies, targets in Southeast Asia, not the Mid-Pacific. Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles from Japan, protected by the vastness of the ocean, seemed safe. On November 26, 1941, the Kido Butai departed from Hito Kapu Bay in the remote Kuril Islands and turned east, toward Hawaii. The task force included not just the 6 carriers but also battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and support vessels. 33 ships in total, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. The ships maintained strict radio silence. They followed a northern route, through empty ocean where they were unlikely to encounter merchant shipping. And in Hawaii, 3,400 miles away, American commanders received vague warnings about possible hostilities but no specific intelligence about an attack on Pearl Harbor. The pieces were moving into place. The attack was coming. And America, despite all the warnings, despite all the intelligence, would be caught completely by surprise. For nearly 2 weeks, the Kido Butai steamed eastward across the North Pacific. The weather was terrible: storms, high seas, freezing rain. Ships rolled violently. Sailors struggled to maintain their footing on slippery decks. Aircraft were lashed down to prevent them from breaking loose. It was miserable, exhausting, and nerve-wracking. But the storms had an advantage: they provided cover. American patrol aircraft, grounded by bad weather, never spotted the approaching task force. Merchant ships, avoiding the storm-tossed northern route, never crossed paths with the Japanese fleet. The Kido Butai advanced undetected, drawing closer to Hawaii with each passing day. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, life continued with peacetime normalcy. Pearl Harbor was home to the Pacific Fleet, 8 battleships, numerous cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and support vessels. The harbor was a secure anchorage, protected by shore batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and patrol aircraft. American commanders believed it was virtually impregnable. Saturday, December 6th, was a typical weekend day. Sailors went on liberty, visiting Honolulu's bars and entertainment districts. Officers attended social functions. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter Short, commander of Army forces in Hawaii, went about their routine duties. Both men had received warnings from Washington about possible Japanese aggression, but these warnings were vague and focused on potential attacks in Southeast Asia. Saturday night merged into Sunday morning. Most of the fleet remained in port, the battleships moored along Battleship Row on the eastern side of Ford Island in the middle of Pearl Harbor. Some were moored singly. Others were moored in pairs, side by side, to conserve berth space. The ships were in Condition 3, a peacetime readiness level with reduced manning and most watertight doors open for ventilation in the tropical heat. Many sailors had returned late from Saturday liberty and were sleeping in after a long night. The duty watch was minimal. Anti-aircraft ammunition was locked in magazines, requiring authorization from a duty officer to be brought out and loaded. It was Sunday morning in paradise, and no one expected anything unusual. At 6 a.m. on December 7th, the Kido Butai reached its launch position 230 miles north of Oahu. The carriers turned into the wind. Flight deck crews prepared aircraft for launch. Pilots, many of them veterans of the war in China, among the most experienced naval aviators in the world, climbed into their cockpits. The first wave consisted of 183 aircraft, 43 fighters, 49 high-level bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 40 torpedo bombers. They would be led by Commander Mitsu Fukaida, a seasoned pilot and the airstrike commander. Fukaida's orders were clear: achieve complete surprise, strike the battleships first, destroy American air power on the ground, and clear the way for the second wave. At 6:15 a.m., the first aircraft roared down the carrier's flight decks and lifted into the pre-dawn darkness. One after another, within minutes, all 183 aircraft were airborne, forming up into attack groups and turning south toward Oahu. The sun was rising now, casting pink and orange light across the ocean. The weather was clearing. Visibility was excellent. From Fukaida's lead aircraft, the formation looked beautiful, waves of aircraft in tight formation, flying toward their objective, ready to deliver the blow that would, they believed, cripple American power in the Pacific. At 7:02 a.m., 2 Army radar operators at the Opana Point radar station on the northern coast of Oahu detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north, about 130 miles out. They reported it to the information center at Fort Shafter. But the duty officer, inexperienced and unaware of the impending attack, assumed it was a flight of B-17 bombers expected to arrive from California that morning. He told the radar operators don't worry about it and returned to his breakfast. The warning was dismissed. At approximately 6:45 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward, on patrol outside Pearl Harbor, encountered and sank a Japanese midget submarine attempting to enter the harbor. The Ward's captain reported the action, but the message was delayed and downplayed. By the time it reached senior commanders, it was too late. Another warning missed. At 7:49 a.m., Commander Fukaida's formation reached the northern coast of Oahu. Below them, the island was peaceful. No anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them. No American fighters scrambled to intercept. The surprise was complete. Fukaida ordered his radioman to transmit the code signal confirming total surprise: Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. At 7:55 a.m., the attack began. Japanese dive bombers screamed down on Wheeler Field and Hickam Field, the Army Air Corps bases where most American aircraft in Hawaii were parked. Bombs exploded among tightly packed rows of planes. Aircraft erupted in flames. Hangars collapsed. Within minutes, American air power on Oahu, which might have defended against the attack, was largely destroyed on the ground. Simultaneously, Japanese torpedo bombers swept low over Pearl Harbor, dropping their specially modified torpedoes. The weapons splashed into the water, ran straight and shallow, and slammed into the battleships moored along Battleship Row. The USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the USS Maryland, was struck by 5 torpedoes in rapid succession. The hits tore massive holes in her port side. Water flooded in with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the massive battleship began to roll. Sailors trapped below decks struggled to escape through passageways that were rapidly becoming vertical shafts. Some made it out. Many did not. At 8:08 a.m., just 13 minutes after the attack began, the Oklahoma capsized completely, rolling over until her bottom faced the sky. Over 400 men were trapped inside, entombed in the overturned hull. Rescue crews would spend days cutting through the hull, saving 32 men who had survived in air pockets. The rest died in the darkness. But the worst was yet to come. The USS Arizona, moored inboard along Battleship Row, was struck by 4 armor-piercing bombs converted from naval artillery shells. These massive bombs, 1,760 pounds each, penetrated deep into the ship before exploding. At 8:06 a.m., one of these bombs struck near the Arizona's forward magazines, the storage areas for the ship's main battery ammunition. The explosion that followed was catastrophic. The forward magazines detonated, creating a massive secondary explosion that literally tore the forward part of the ship apart. A fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air. The ship's forward superstructure collapsed. The explosion was so powerful it lifted the 35,000-ton battleship partially out of the water. The Arizona settled rapidly, her forward half shattered, her decks awash with burning oil. Of the 1,512 crewmen aboard that morning, 1,177 were killed, some by the initial explosions, others trapped below decks as the ship settled, still others consumed by the fires that burned on the water's surface for days afterward. More men died on the Arizona than on any other ship that day. Today, the wreck remains at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, a tomb for the hundreds who went down with her, marked by a memorial that spans the sunken hull. The USS West Virginia was struck by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. She settled to the bottom of the harbor, sitting upright in the shallow water. The USS California took 2 torpedoes and slowly sank over the next 3 days. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, made a brave but ultimately futile attempt to escape the harbor before being heavily damaged and deliberately beached to avoid blocking the harbor entrance. All along Battleship Row, ships were burning, sinking, or heavily damaged. The harbor was covered with oil, thick, black oil from ruptured fuel tanks, much of it on fire. Men in the water swam through burning oil, their skin blistering, many drowning before they could reach safety. Rescue boats moved among the wrecks, pulling survivors from the water, trying to reach men trapped in overturned or sunken ships. And throughout this chaos, throughout the explosions and fires and death, the fundamental question was, what is happening? Many Americans, waking to the sound of explosions, initially thought it was an unusually realistic drill. The idea that this was an actual attack, that Japanese aircraft were bombing Pearl Harbor, seemed impossible. But the reality became undeniable as ships exploded, as buildings collapsed, as men died. This was not a drill. This was war. And America had been caught completely unprepared. The first wave attack lasted approximately 1 hour. By 9 a.m., the surviving aircraft were turning north, heading back to their carriers. Behind them, Pearl Harbor was a scene of devastation. For battleships sunk or sinking, others heavily damaged. The harbor choked with debris, oil, and bodies. Fires burning everywhere. And American defenders, finally beginning to organize, manning whatever anti-aircraft guns they could reach, preparing for what they feared might be a follow-up attack or even an invasion. They did not have long to wait. The second wave was already approaching. At 8:54 a.m., while the first wave was still attacking, the second wave of 171 aircraft had launched from the Japanese carriers. This wave consisted of 54 high-level bombers, 78 dive bombers, and 36 fighters. Their targets were the same: the ships, the airfields, the facilities, but now they would face organized resistance. By the time the second wave arrived over Oahu at approximately 8:40 a.m., they had launched later but followed a more direct route. American anti-aircraft defenses were awake and fighting back. Gunners who had been sleeping an hour earlier were now manning their weapons. Ammunition that had been locked in magazines was now being loaded and fired. The second wave would not have the advantage of complete surprise. But surprise or not, the second wave pressed home its attacks with the same determination as the first. More bombs fell on the damaged ships. More aircraft were destroyed on the ground. And American casualties continued to mount. But now, at last, Americans were fighting back. And in the midst of the chaos and destruction, acts of heroism were beginning to emerge, stories of courage, sacrifice, and determination that would become legend. As the second wave attacked, American defenders fought back with whatever weapons they could bring to bear. Anti-aircraft guns that had been silent during the first wave now filled the sky with explosive shells. Machine gunners fired at low-flying aircraft. Even sailors with rifles tried to shoot down the attackers. The sky over Pearl Harbor became a deadly maze of tracers, exploding shells, and diving aircraft. Several Japanese planes were hit and crashed in flames. Others limped back toward their carriers trailing smoke. The second wave was achieving its objectives, but at a higher cost than the first. Among the American defenders, acts of extraordinary courage emerged from the chaos. Doris Miller, a mess attendant, a position African Americans were largely restricted to in the segregated U.S. Navy, was aboard the USS West Virginia when the attack began. Miller, who had no formal combat training, helped move his mortally wounded captain to safety, then manned an anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he had never been trained to use, and fired at Japanese aircraft until ordered to abandon ship. He would later become the first African American to be awarded the Navy Cross. On the capsized USS Oklahoma, sailors trapped inside worked together to find escape routes, often swimming through flooded, pitch-black compartments to reach air pockets where they could breathe while waiting for rescue. In one of the most famous rescue operations, Navy crews cut through the Oklahoma's hull over several days, saving 32 men who had survived in air pockets inside the overturned ship. But perhaps the most dramatic American resistance came not from the ships or anti-aircraft batteries, but from a handful of Army Air Corps pilots who managed to get airborne during the attack and engage the Japanese in air-to-air combat. Second Lieutenants George Welsh and Kenneth Taylor, stationed at Halewa Field on the north coast of Oahu, were among the few American pilots who managed to take off during the attack. When the Japanese struck, Welsh and Taylor were returning from an all-night poker game. They immediately drove to Halewa, a small auxiliary field that the Japanese had not targeted, jumped into P-40 Warhawk fighters, and took off into a sky filled with enemy aircraft. Welsh and Taylor dove into formations of Japanese aircraft, guns blazing. Despite being outnumbered and facing experienced enemy pilots, they shot down at least 6 Japanese aircraft between them, possibly more, with claims disputed in the chaos of combat. Taylor was wounded when his P-40 was hit, but he managed to land safely. Both pilots took off again after refueling and rearming, engaging the second wave as well. Their actions, while they could not change the outcome of the attack, demonstrated that American pilots, given even the slightest opportunity, could fight back effectively. These were not helpless victims, these were warriors who, caught by surprise, nevertheless rose to fight. By 9:45 a.m., the last aircraft of the second wave were departing, turning north toward the carriers. The attack was over. The sound of aircraft engines faded. The explosions ceased. And an eerie, smoke-filled quiet settled over Pearl Harbor. The damage was catastrophic. 8 battleships had been hit, 4 sunk or beached, the others heavily damaged. 3 cruisers were damaged. 3 destroyers were sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft were destroyed, most on the ground. The infrastructure of Pearl Harbor, repair facilities, fuel storage, administrative buildings, had been hit but not destroyed. And most terrible of all, the human cost. 2,403 Americans were killed in the attack, 2,008 Navy, 218 Army, 109 Marines, 68 civilians. Another 1,178 were wounded. In less than 2 hours, more Americans had died than in any single day in American military history up to that point. Families would receive telegrams in the coming days and weeks, informing them that sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers would not be coming home. Entire communities, small towns that had sent multiple men to serve together, would be devastated by the losses. The grief would be national, personal, and profound. Aboard the Japanese carriers, as the aircraft returned and landed, the mood was jubilant. The attack had exceeded expectations. American battleships had been destroyed. The Pacific Fleet appeared to be crippled. Pilots reported minimal opposition during the first wave. Losses had been light, 29 aircraft lost, far fewer than the worst-case estimates. But Commander Fukaida, the airstrike commander, was troubled. He recommended launching a third wave, more aircraft to strike targets that had been missed or inadequately damaged. Specifically, he wanted to destroy the fuel storage tanks that held millions of gallons of oil, without which the Pacific Fleet could not operate. He also wanted to target the repair facilities, the dry docks, machine shops, and infrastructure that would allow the Americans to salvage and repair damaged ships. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai, faced a decision. The attack had been a success. The objectives had been achieved, or appeared to have been achieved. But launching a third wave meant remaining in the area for hours, recovering aircraft, rearming and refueling them, and launching again. It meant increased risk of American counterattack. American carriers, whereabouts unknown, might be approaching. American submarines might be converging on the task force. Nagumo decided against the third wave. The task force would withdraw immediately, heading northwest, away from Hawaii. The attack was over. It was, in hindsight, a catastrophic error. The fuel storage tanks, containing 4.5 million barrels of oil, remained intact. Without them, the Pacific Fleet would have been forced to withdraw to the west coast, thousands of miles away, effectively ceding the Central Pacific to Japan for months or longer. The repair facilities remained operational, allowing the Americans to salvage most of the damaged ships and return them to service far faster than the Japanese anticipated. And most critically, the 3 American aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, had not been in port during the attack and remained undamaged. The carriers, not the battleships, would prove to be the decisive weapons in the Pacific War. And Japan had failed to destroy them. Admiral Yamamoto, when he learned of the attack's success, was not jubilant. He reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually spoke those exact words is debated, but the sentiment was accurate. Yamamoto understood America's potential. He knew that the attack had achieved tactical success but might prove a strategic disaster. The attack on Pearl Harbor was supposed to cripple American naval power and convince the United States to negotiate a peace settlement. Instead, it would unite the American people as nothing else could have, transforming a divided nation with significant isolationist sentiment into a fully mobilized war machine determined to achieve total victory. Word of the attack reached Washington on Sunday afternoon East Coast time. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was having lunch when he received the news. He immediately convened his cabinet and military advisors. That evening, he began drafting the speech he would deliver to Congress the next day, a speech that would define the moment and rally the nation. That night, across America, families gathered around radios to hear the news bulletins. The details were fragmentary, confusing, often contradictory. But the basic facts were clear: America had been attacked. The Pacific Fleet had been heavily damaged. Casualties were high. And the nation was, effectively, at war. The next morning, December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt traveled to the Capitol to address a joint session of Congress. The chamber was packed: congressmen, senators, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, military officers. The nation listened on radio. And Roosevelt delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. President Roosevelt's speech to Congress on December 8, 1941, lasted just over 6 minutes. It was brief, direct, and powerful. And it began with words that would echo through history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt recounted the attack, the casualties, the damage. He noted that Japan had been conducting diplomatic negotiations with the United States even as its forces were approaching Hawaii, a detail that underscored the perceived treachery of the attack. And he called on Congress to declare that a state of war existed between the United States and Japan. The vote was overwhelming. The House of Representatives approved the declaration 388 to 1. The Senate voted 82 to 0. Only Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against American entry into World War I, voted against the declaration. Within hours, America was officially at war. And 3 days later, on December 11th, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States. America's war would not be limited to the Pacific. It would be a global conflict, fought on multiple continents against multiple enemies. The World War that had begun in Europe in 1939 and expanded to Asia would now truly encompass the globe. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed American society and American politics overnight. The debate between isolationists and interventionists, which had raged for years, dividing the nation, ended instantly. On December 6th, a significant portion of the American public opposed involvement in foreign wars. On December 8th, the nation was virtually unanimous in its determination to fight. The transformation was total. Industries that had been producing consumer goods converted to war production. Young men, millions of them, volunteered for military service or were drafted. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in factories, shipyards, and aircraft plants. The entire economy shifted to a war footing, with rationing, price controls, and government direction of industrial production. But the attack also exposed serious failures in American military preparedness and intelligence. How had Japan been able to approach Hawaii undetected? Why had the warnings from Washington been so vague and confusing? Why had the radar sighting and the submarine contact been dismissed? Why were aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, perfect targets for attack? Investigations would follow, most notably the Roberts Commission, which began work within weeks of the attack. Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the commanders in Hawaii, were relieved of duty and would spend the rest of their lives defending their actions. The question of responsibility for Pearl Harbor would be debated for decades, with historians and military analysts reaching different conclusions about where blame should fall. But beyond the questions of blame and responsibility lay the strategic reality. Pearl Harbor was not the decisive blow Japan had hoped for. Yes, the battleships had been sunk or damaged. Yes, thousands of Americans had been killed. Yes, the Pacific Fleet had suffered a significant setback. But the carriers had survived. The submarines had survived. The fuel and repair facilities had survived. And within months, many of the damaged ships would be salvaged, repaired, and returned to service. The USS West Virginia, California, and Nevada, battleships that had been sunk or beached at Pearl Harbor would all be raised, repaired, and would fight again later in the war. More fundamentally, the attack had given America something it desperately needed: unity of purpose. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States was a divided nation, uncertain about its role in a world at war. After Pearl Harbor, it was a nation united, determined, and increasingly confident in its ability to mobilize its resources and achieve victory. The Japanese had calculated that America, facing a long and costly war across the Pacific, would seek a negotiated peace rather than commit to total war. They could not have been more wrong. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not break American will, it forged it. The sneak attack, coming while Japanese diplomats were still conducting negotiations in Washington, was seen not as a brilliant military stroke but as a treacherous act that demanded full retribution. Remember Pearl Harbor became the rallying cry, printed on posters, spoken at recruitment rallies, invoked whenever the war seemed difficult or the casualties too high. The memory of that Sunday morning, of the men who died in the burning ships, would sustain American determination through 4 years of bitter fighting across the Pacific and around the world. In the broader sweep of history, the attack on Pearl Harbor represents one of the great strategic miscalculations of the 20th century. Japan sought to cripple American naval power and secure a free hand in Southeast Asia. Instead, the attack brought into the war the one nation with the industrial capacity, manpower, and resources to ensure Japan's ultimate defeat. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, American carrier-based aircraft would sink 4 Japanese carriers, including Akagi and Kaga, 2 of the carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Navy would never recover from that defeat. And from Midway onward, the trajectory of the Pacific War was clear. Japan would be pushed back, island by island, until ultimate defeat. Today, the USS Arizona Memorial spans the sunken hull of the battleship, its white structure visible above the water that still holds the remains of over 1,000 American sailors. Oil continues to leak from the wreck, sometimes called the Tears of the Arizona, rising to the surface in small droplets, a reminder that the ship still bleeds 8 decades later. Every year, survivors of the attack, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, return to Pearl Harbor for memorial services on December 7th. They are joined by families of those who died, by active duty military personnel, and by ordinary Americans who come to remember what happened on that Sunday morning and to honor those who died. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, 7:55 a.m. A date which will live in infamy. A morning that began in peace and ended in war. An attack that killed 2,403 Americans but awakened a nation. A tactical victory that led to strategic defeat. And a tragedy that transformed the course of the Second World War and the shape of the modern world. The generation that fought that war, the greatest generation, as they came to be called, is passing into history. But the memory of Pearl Harbor remains. It reminds us that freedom must be defended, that vigilance is the price of security, and that from tragedy can come unity, resolve, and ultimately, victory. Remember Pearl Harbor. The devastation was complete, over 2,400 lives lost, and the backbone of the Pacific Fleet temporarily broken. Yet, in their tactical brilliance, the Japanese made a critical strategic blunder. They failed to hit the oil storage, the repair yards, or the crucial aircraft carriers. The attack was meant to force America to the negotiating table. Instead, it delivered unity and resolve. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and the United States was irrevocably plunged into the global conflict. Pearl Harbor was a devastating loss, but it proved to be the ultimate catalyst, awakening a sleeping giant whose power and fury would soon be unleashed across the Pacific. If you want to understand the monumental events and critical eras that determine the course of warfare, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, do you believe the failure to destroy the oil storage tanks was the single greatest strategic mistake made by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor? Thanks for watching.